vietnamita acaba de demostrarse que aunque parezcan enormes, los grandes no son tan grandes.
Puerto Rico se dispone a liberarse, a tener su patria libre, sin miedo al yanqui gigante.
Ya estás viendo Puerto Rico de una manera palpable, que los pueblos más pequeños también suelen empinarse.
Puerto Rico se dispone a liberarse, a tener su patria libre, sin miedo al yanqui gigante.
Y recuerda la leyenda de Goliat, aquel gigante, a quien David el pequeño le hizo rendir y humillarse.
Puerto Rico se dispone a liberarse, a tener su patria libre, sin miedo al yanqui gigante.
El yanqui tiene cañones y mañas para explotarte, pero Puerto Rico tiene otra cosa en que apoyarse.
Puerto Rico se dispone a liberarse, a tener su patria libre, sin miedo al yanqui gigante.
Puerto Rico tiene un pueblo heredero de Betances, que en el momento presente se decide a liberarse.
Puerto Rico se dispone a liberarse, a tener su patria libre, sin miedo al yanqui gigante.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome in. I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay.
We can hear you.
Okay, awesome. Te no a ni washale bahi ni to ta e te bano pa shon ba. Hello, everybody. My name is Reyes DeVore. I am from the Pueblo of Jemez. I currently serve as the Community Programming Director for Pueblo Action Alliance, but I am here this evening helping to amplify the work of the Anti-War Coalition, along with some other grassroots organizations that are helping to bring this space to you all. So just wanted to give a little bit of a context for this evening. We just, really wanted to make sure that we were providing a space for our our community members and our people to really understand what is going on with, what's happening in Ukraine with Russia. And the Anti-War Coalition, consists of various community members and organizations that are, grassroots who work to dismantle and educate our communities on the impacts of war. So tonight we present to you No War, No Imperialism. And, we thank you all for taking time out of your evening to be here with us, to become educated and to learn more. As we collectively, have come together to bring this teach-in to you all, we knew that it was really important to make sure that we were making this space intergenerational and accessible, breaking down the information, really breaking down those terms, the acronyms that, that we're seeing everywhere. But not only that, we just really wanted to make sure that, we're providing the right information, because we acknowledge that, the the news sources that we see and our media sources aren't always giving us the right information. You know, they are definitely, you know, can come from like the far right, or, you know, it's just skewed information. And so, you know, we just really want to make sure that everybody also understands that what is, you know, happening there is ultimately going to impact us here in the US. So again, thank you everybody for coming into this space, but I do also want to make sure that we provide a land acknowledgement as well. And so I would like to take a moment to do that, because especially when we're going to go into the conversation of talking about imperialism and talking about war, you know, it's also violence against the land, and especially as Indigenous peoples, you know, it can be triggering for us to see that, you know, there's just like this cycle of violence. So tonight I am coming to you from Southern Tiwa territory, so-called Albuquerque, New Mexico. There was actually once 12 Tiwa speaking villages that lived along the Rio Grande from, you know, Bernalillo all the way down to a Sleta community. And they fought in the Tigwe War, which is like the first named war against the settler expedition by Coronado. And it's important to, you know, acknowledge that you know, our Tiwa peoples, our ancestors, and the living community members that are here, because you know, most of us that are here presenting to you all live and organize and occupy their land, their traditional land base. So definitely want to take a moment to make sure we, you know, recognize them in the territory. So I do see some of you all dropping in, you know, where you're coming from. So if you want to drop your name in the chat, also acknowledge the land and the territory that you are coming in from, we would appreciate that. And I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Oni.
Thanks, Reyes. Sorry, let me remove the spotlight from you and put it on me. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much, Reyes, for this introduction. First of all, I want to say that we do have Spanish interpretation on the webinar for folks that need it. You just need to click on that globe icon in your toolbar, and you can select the language you want to hear the webinar in, either English and Spanish. There's also Spanish instructions in the chat. And as Reyes said, this teach-in is brought to you by a number of social justice organizations doing great work here in Tiwa territory and throughout the world. Those organizations include the Black Alliance for Peace and the Red Nation, who are joining us today. Also, Offering People's Revolutionary Party, My Political Home, the Red Ant Collective, Showing Up for Racial Justice, Albuquerque, and Pueblo Action Alliance. So before we jump into what we're going to be talking about today, I just wanted to give y'all a lay of the land so you know what's happening. So I'm going to share my screen. And so here we have the schedule of events for this teach-in, the topics that we are hoping to cover or that we will be covering. So first up, we want to give all of us a baseline understanding of what we mean when we say imperialism. We don't want to just like throw words around that have like many different meanings or maybe that folks haven't been exposed to before. So we're going to give you like a 101 level explanation of what imperialism even is. And it's going to be Comrade Keegan from Red Ant Collective who will do that. Second part of the presentation will provide some historical context for the current incredibly stressful and dangerous political moment. We all know what's happening in Ukraine, what's unfolding there. It seems really scary. We're hearing like a lot of lies, to be honest with you, on the news. And so the Black Alliance for Peace and the All African People's Revolutionary Party will work together in the second part of the teach-in to give y'all the political and historical context of this moment. Third section, Pueblo Action Alliance and the Red Nation, are going to be talking about the sanctions that were placed upon Russia by, at this point, the entire Western world, and the impact those sanctions are going to have across the globe, including right here in the Western Hemisphere. As a matter of fact, those sanctions are most likely going to lead to increased extraction in indigenous territories in the United States and throughout the Western Hemisphere, and they're going to explain why. And then the last part, once we've given you all of that context, all of that education, all of that analysis about the local impact of what imperialism is doing in Eastern Europe, we're going to talk about what we do now. With all this information, what is the next step? And that's going to be all of the orgs who participated in this teach-in, giving our opinion on what happens next. And then after that, we're gonna have a Q&A where y'all will have the opportunity to ask questions. You can definitely submit questions throughout the event as they come up. Just put them either in the Q&A section of Zoom by clicking the two bubbles labeled Q&A, or you can just put them in the chat and we'll find them and collect them. But anyway, we'll have 30 minutes for a Q&A from y'all, so you can ask us any questions you want. So that is the run of show. And with that, I'm gonna get us started by passing it to Keegan, who's gonna talk about what is imperialism.
All right, greetings everybody. I'm very grateful to be here with all of you this evening. And yeah, so we just thought it was really critical to define what we mean when we say imperialism. It's a word that I feel like has gotten more usage in the past few years and is being used more and more by nonprofits and by mainstream media. And so we just want to be very clear about what we mean when we say that word. So next slide. So just to briefly talk about the common definition that is often, again, used implicitly by media and by nonprofits and things like that, is they'll say it means something like a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. And so we feel like this definition is incomplete. It's not necessarily that it's wrong. Imperial powers, as we see them, absolutely do use diplomatic pressure through organizations like the United Nations, or they use military force through intervention, bombing, drone strikes, etc. But this definition ignores the importance of capitalism, the dominant global economic system, in extending that power and influence, and how imperialists use tools that are rooted in that global economic system to pressure other countries to do what they want. So next slide, please. So to talk about imperialism then is to also talk about capitalism. And so we just want to lay out, if we do some in-depth study of capitalism, we realize that capitalist powers and capitalists are always looking for humans to do labor. They're always looking for raw materials, and they're always looking for access to sell these places, as well as land, in order to either extract or to control. And the key part of this is that they want these things at the lowest possible cost. And if that cost is zero, then they'll take that. And so that's how we've seen, people get enslaved by the millions. That's how we've seen land, like all of the, so-called United States, is land that has been stolen from other people. So again, that desire to get those things will lead capitalist powers to take things if they can. Next slide, please. This leads us to two strategies that are kind of proto-imperial strategies, which are colonialism and settler colonialism, which Western European powers were enormous colonial powers for hundreds of years, the United States a little bit later. These both use war, guns, and armies as a way of taking land, controlling people, and taking resources. So a military is like the primary means of enforcing these strategies that capitalist powers have used. And we can see that a lot of the world was robbed of their resources by Western European and eventually American powers over the last couple hundred years. We can think of Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean, in Asia, have all been held up at gunpoint by various colonial powers and settler colonial powers over the past couple hundred years. Next slide, please. And so imperialism is kind of a development and a newer strategy that capitalist countries have used to control other countries and other peoples. And so as we mentioned earlier, the missing component of the common definition is that it doesn't include the importance of capitalism and the very, very intricately linked nature of the global economy that we have now. And so imperialism uses a wider range of tools than simply military strength. This is not to say that military strength is not an important part of imperialism, but it's just that this economic system is also a way that predominantly Western Europe and the United States, the biggest imperial powers in the world, use to strangle other countries to control land, people, and resources. And the kicker is that a lot of these tools are either completely obscured in our media, or they're talked about in ways that make them seem like they're humane. So we could take sanctions as an example. Sanctions are often something, a way of blocking a country from accessing trade, from accessing global finance if they want to get a loan. And we think about this, and our media often portrays sanctions as something that are, a humane alternative to war, to invasions, to bombing. When those of us who study sanctions deeply know that sanctions are actually a very brutal form of economic warfare, that they result in the deaths of, over the last many years, hundreds of thousands or millions of civilians, that they restrict access to medicine and to food and to other, resources and supplies that are necessary for living. So that's just one example of a tool that imperialism has, that our media has taught us to think about as humane, but is not in fact humane at all. Next slide, please. And so there are other tools, again, that imperialism uses alongside military force. So if we think about, again, the fact that Western European powers and the United States have robbed Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean of so much wealth and resources over the past couple hundred years, many of these countries, when they finally got unoccupied, finally got Western European guns taken out of their states and tried to stand on their own 2 feet and live as countries, they need money to invest because they've had so much stolen from them. And in order to access that kind of money, they have to enter this global capitalist system that is dominated by the United States and Western Europe. And so, for example, if they're looking for a loan, you often have to go knocking at the doors of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which are both, again, controlled by Western Europe and the United States. And these loans don't come without conditions. These loans come with conditions that favor exploitation by Western powers of these different countries who are simply looking to develop their economies and get themselves in a place where their people are doing better. And some of those types of the conditions are things like deregulating their economy to make things cheaper for Western powers to put businesses there so workers can get more exploited, along with other things that deregulate the economy, make things worse for the environment. And also privatizing goods that might have been held in public by these countries, like water, like land, so that, again, Western imperial powers can commodify those things and make money out of them. This also can come in the form of funding opposition to governments that do not somehow want to fit into this system. And we say there's more just because there's so many more tools that imperialism uses to have a stranglehold, again, alongside military force, but not necessarily primarily all the time. Next slide, please. And so another really devastating consequence of this is that all of these countries who've had their wealth looted for centuries, who are now trying to enter a global economic system, are being kept in a intentionally underdeveloped and being kept dependent on money from and resources from the United States and Western Europe. And so this creates dependency in a couple different ways. We mentioned a couple. Another one is that the debt, as I mentioned earlier, that is often offered by the International Monetary Fund, the interest rates can vary wildly. And so many countries are now locked in these enormous cycles of debt that now give Western European and US countries power and leverage in saying how that country should be run, because they are now locked in what people refer to as debt traps. Next slide, please. And just to circle back to the understanding that, again, imperialism is not that it doesn't have the threat of military force, right? But it also uses economic means to secure land, people, and resources to make money for the United States and other Western European powers. And so this is a map from 2020 of confirmed US military bases. And you can see that there are 750 bases in 80 countries around the world. And there are some estimates that put this higher, but these are confirmed. And so you can see these are all over the world. And this is absolutely threatening to countries who are wanting to perhaps make their own way, or wanting to perhaps develop themselves in a way different than the United States and Western Europe are often dictating. But it's probably terrifying, right, to have the United States, the most powerful military in the world, be sitting in your back door all over the world. And just for a little bit of context, Russia has confirmed about 20 military bases outside of its border, and most of those are in former USSR states. And China has one confirmed military base outside of its borders. So just as some context for other powers that are referred to as great military powers. Next slide, please. And then just to say briefly about the brutal violence of imperialism, again, as we mentioned earlier, sanctions are a really, really violent thing. And the United States, itself, to say nothing of the sanctions offered by other not offered, but dictated by other Western European countries, the United States itself sanctions about a third of the world. That's like over 2 billion people, which again is rightly referred to as economic warfare. And we'd need this whole screen and perhaps a whole slide presentation to list all of the countries that have been destroyed by either sanctions, their economies ruined, or militarily by the United States. We list a few here. Haiti is still dealing with debt imposed on them by the French from freeing themselves from slavery and subjugation. Yemen, Somalia, the list is very long, and again includes indigenous nations, for example, in the United States, that still are in the United States. And then the last point we wanted to make is that the US and NATO, because of their enormous militaries, we just saw this map of all of these military bases the United States has, have an enormous impact on climate change. And in terms of so much resource use, so much fossil fuel use. And so this is an enormous contributor to one of the biggest crises of our time, global warming. Next slide, please. And so we're gonna leave it there. We just wanted to offer a quote from Thomas Sankara, who was a revolutionary and former president of Burkina Faso. And of imperialism, Sankara says, "Imperialism is a system of exploitation that occurs not only in the brutal form of those who come with guns to conquer territory. Imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms: a loan, food aid, blackmail. We are fighting this system that allows a handful of men on Earth to rule all of humanity." And with that, I'll leave it, and I'll pass it back to Oni, and I'm grateful again to be here with you all. Thank you.
Oh my God. All right, y'all, let me replace myself. Okay, so thank you so much, Keegan, for that introduction, helping us at a baseline understanding, again, of what imperialism is. That was a very deep coverage of the topic that was still very accessible in less than 10 minutes. Incredible. So now let's move on to talking about what's happening in the world right now and how we got to this point. And for that conversation, I'm going to pass it to you, Jackie, with Black Alliance for Peace.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you so much for having me in this discussion. I am going to do my best to stay within my 10-minute time limit because there's a lot to cover. I timed it this time, so let's see if I can get there. First, the history of NATO, when and why NATO was formed, because NATO is the primary contradiction here, along with imperialism, US and EU imperialism. NATO was formed in 1949 after World War II, and its stated goals were to protect the interests of North Atlantic nations against the threat of the USSR. But NATO should really never be viewed separately from the economic agreements and the systems that were created, that NATO was created to defend. And so after World War II, the US brokered two pivotal agreements with European nations that suffered economically during the war. The first was the Bretton Woods Agreement, BRETTON. This was an agreement negotiated by 703 delegates from 44 countries. And it said that the currencies of those countries had to be tied to the value of the US dollar, while the US dollar was backed by the value of gold. That's the gold standard. That is not true anymore. But at the time, the 44 countries involved in this agreement were the US, Canada, Western European countries, Australia, and Japan. South Africa and Ethiopia that just defeated the fascist Italians, South Africa and Ethiopia, apartheid South, well, they were not apartheid yet, but they were on their way to it, were the only African countries in this agreement. At the time of the signing, most other African nations were still colonized by their European overlords. So Africa got scooped into this agreement through their European colonizers. Russia was invited to participate and actually signed the Bretton Woods Final Act, but ultimately they rejected the idea of tying their ruble to the US dollar alongside gold. So they said that the institutions that this agreement had created were branches of Wall Street. They literally said that. And they weren't wrong, because Bretton Woods and the monetary system that it created promoted this international economic growth and prevented competitive currency devaluations. It just means that nobody else could trade in anything else but the dollar. So the country that controlled the dollar benefited the most among the capitalist countries, including the colonizers on the continent. The SWIFT financial system, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund arose out of that agreement. The second pivotal agreement was the Marshall Plan that was implemented in 1948. 16 European nations, including formerly Nazi Germany, received nearly $13 billion in all kinds of aid. This is $13 billion in 1948 money, right? In all kinds of aid from the US. But most important is the machinery that gave the US the opportunity for investment, direct investment in the industrial recovery and capacity in Europe. And this direct investment in rebuilding a decimated Europe helped shape what we know today as the European Union. Because of this, European economies recovered and grew at an unprecedented rate. Trade relations among these rebuilt countries and the US led to the formation of the North Atlantic Alliance. Now, the Soviet Union was offered aid through the Marshall Plan, but they didn't trust the Marshall Plan, obviously, because first of all, they were deeply opposed to the US giving aid to Nazi Germany that just decimated Russia. They did not like the whole, capitalist imperialism, which is literally what Foreign Secretary Molotov called the Marshall Plan. And they really just didn't want to be beholden to the US. So the Soviet Union opted out of the Marshall Plan. And out of the North Atlantic Alliance comes NATO, whose stated goals are to protect the interests of the North Atlantic Alliance members. But the interests of those members are global capitalism, which makes NATO literally the military arm of these economic agreements, Bretton Woods and the Marshall Plan, the armed thugs of white supremacy and pan-European capitalist hegemony, aka imperialism. So where does Russia fit into this after these agreements? The implementation of these agreements was arguably the beginning of the Cold War against Russia after World War II, especially after Russia was like, nope, not doing it. The US and its European allies saw that the USSR was a threat to the capitalist order that they were creating in Europe with these agreements. Why? Because the USSR is communist. And although it was Stalin's Soviet Red Army that literally saved the world and lost 27 million Soviets fighting the Nazis and defeating them, Winston Churchill and US President Harry Truman began this ideological campaign against Stalin and the USSR immediately after the war. Here's a fun fact. The term Iron Curtain comes to prominence only after it was used by Winston Churchill in a speech at Fulton, Missouri, here in the US on March 5th, 1946, when he said of the communist states, quote, "An iron curtain has descended across the continent," end quote. And I'm only mentioning Churchill because honestly, I don't think he gets enough heat when we're talking about World War II. So I'm gonna focus on him a little bit because Churchill was a virulent anti-communist. He said that Bolshevism was not a policy, it's a disease, it's not a creed, it's a pestilence. He even compared Stalin's Soviet Union, that again, just saved the world from the Nazis. He compared them to the Axis powers, who were the Nazis. So when we look at comparisons of Putin to Hitler today, not new at all. Churchill also wanted the US to control the Soviet Union in Europe through the use of nuclear weapons. Churchill literally wanted to nuke the US to nuke the Soviet Union into submission. But what the US did instead was what got us here. But first, the reason you'll hear for the way Churchill and Truman responded to Stalin in Russia was that, Stalin wanted to take over Europe with communism and Churchill had to stop him to save democracy. But that's really not true, because Stanford historian Norman Naimark says in his book, Stalin and the Fate of Europe, the Post-War Struggle for Sovereignty, that Stalin, did want to forward the interests of communism, especially in those areas under his control, but always with a view of not antagonizing the West to the point of being drawn into a military conflict. Why is this important? Because the Soviet Union was barely recovering from being decimated after World War II. It paid a very high cost for signing a deal with during World War II that proved disastrous for millions, and that was the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The only reason this is important is because people get the history wrong. They lie. This was not an agreement between ideological allies or like minds. Hitler and Stalin were not friends. They weren't allies. The pact was a non-aggression pact that both countries' leaders saw as a way to undo unfavorable treaties that they signed in post-World War I. It was supposed to be a 10-year pact that could be renewed, but Hitler was being Hitler and he was like, nah, I'm gonna just take it. So we saw what happened with Hitler invading Poland, and Stalin deeply regretted signing that treaty because 27 million Soviets died defeating the Nazis because of Hitler's duplicity. So at the beginning, NATO's official purpose was to defend Western Europe against the supposed threat of the USSR. But really, it existed to lock Western Europe into the growing US empire under capitalism. So NATO is a white supremacist, imperialist, specifically anti-communist formation. Now we come to the new Cold War, which began almost immediately after the reunification of Germany in 1990, then the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact in that same time when the Soviet Union officially dissolved in 91. Russia didn't put up any resistance to those agreements because they thought they had assurances from the Western powers that they would not move NATO forces closer to Russia's border. But the US and European nations have never seen a treaty or an agreement that they didn't want to break. And those slimy anti-communist thieves reneged on everything they promised to the USSR and to Russia. NATO has advanced farther and farther eastward to Russia's borders. And that is how we get to NATO fucking with Russia all this time today. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it back. Okay, there you go.
Hello, thank you. Replace the spotlight on myself. Okay, thank you so much, Jackie, for that historical context. You might have heard, like the news is saying that Putin is just a maniac and he attacked Ukraine out of nowhere. But if you look at left sources, including in Russia and Ukraine, what you find is what Jackie just explained, that Russia was giving assurances by Western powers that NATO would not expand to their borders. The Western powers broke those promises, continued to expand NATO, almost completely surrounding Russia until it got to Ukraine. So now I want to talk a little bit more about what NATO actually is, because in a lot of the conversations we've heard about the possibility of Ukraine joining NATO, we've heard it described as a defensive alliance, as something that is necessary for the security of the masses of people in Europe. But as Jackie just explained, NATO has never been a defensive alliance. NATO is actually an alliance to protect global capitalism, to fight communism, and also to resist movements to end colonization throughout the global South. Oopsies. I'm having slow computer problems. Worst time ever. So if you know anything about me, you know that I usually start my presentations with like a very strong statement and then I back it up. So that's what we're going to do this time. NATO is not a neutral, defensive, or progressive or anti-fascist force. NATO is a white supremacist military alliance of colonizers and imperialists that should be abolished. Ukraine should not join NATO. No one should join NATO. NATO should not exist. Why do I say that? So the best way to understand how Western imperialism moves is oftentimes to like look at their very own sources, because a lot of times they will literally write out their intent in documents that are later declassified and released for anyone to see. And so what I have a screenshot of on the slide is a report put together in the wake of two conferences that were organized by liberation movements in the global South. The first conference was the 1955 Afro-Asian Conference held in Bandung, Indonesia in 1955. It's also known as the Bandung Conference. And the second conference was the African Asian People's Solidarity Conference that was hosted in Egypt from December 1957 to January 1958. Those two conferences were all about uniting anti-colonial struggles and communist movements in Africa with those in Asia, building solidarity between colonized peoples across borders. As soon as those conferences happened, NATO developed the report that you see screenshot on the page. It's called the Afro-Asian Solidarity Movement, the Threat of a Communist Nationalist Alliance Against the West. And again, this entire document that I'm going to be referring to, you can find on NATO's declassified archives on the NATO website. So we're going to share the slides after this so you can check it out for yourself. But they literally lay out what the problem is. So let's talk about NATO's relationship to the third world. Like Jackie just laid out, NATO was formed to provide for a collective military offense against the USSR and the so-called global threat of communism. For the North Atlantic Treaty Organization powers, the perceived global threat of communism also included anti-colonial movements throughout the third world and the possibility of unity between African and Asian national liberation movements. The reason why NATO powers believed these movements to be a threat is because NATO powers understood, correctly to be honest, that if these nations fought not for national liberation, built socialist states, they would be cut off from the resources the West was looting from them. A direct quote from the report says, the NATO powers believe that these movements were formed with the intent of, quote, accelerating the destruction of the West by depriving it of the markets and sources of raw materials in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So this is them talking about why they oppose these movements. In terms of how NATO has showed up in Africa, I'm going to go into depth about a couple of examples, but I want to start us off from a quote from revolutionary pan-Africanist Walter Rodney. This quote is from his incredible book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. You can actually find the entire PDF online for free, and I highly recommend folks read it. But he says, virtually the whole of North Africa was turned into a sphere of operations for NATO with bases aimed at the Soviet Union. There could have easily developed a nuclear war without African peoples having any knowledge of the matter. The colonial powers actually held military conferences in African cities like Dakar and Nairobi in the early 1950s, inviting the whites of South Africa and Rhodesia and the government of the United States of America. Time and time again, the evidence points to the cynical use of Africa to buttress capitalism economically and militarily, and therefore, in effect, forcing Africa to contribute to its own exploitation. Apart from saving capitalism in times of crisis, the dependencies had always been prolonging the life of capitalism by taking the edge off of the internal contradictions and conflicts which were a part of the capitalist system. Once again, that is Walter Rodney, an excerpt from How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, talking about why Western powers had military bases in Africa, why NATO had military bases in Africa. What he's saying there is that the West, the NATO powers, use the exploitation of Africa, use the stealing of African resources and labor to both develop their war machines. For example, the uranium that was used to develop the West atom bombs was mined in Africa. And they also used the exploitation of Africa as a release valve for capitalism in crisis in Western countries. What they did essentially was give European workers a cut of the spoils of colonialism to keep them pacified. So this is why NATO and now AFRICOM, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, have a military presence in Africa. It's not about defending Europe. It's not about any kind of protection of people. It's about maintaining Western control of Africa's resources by repressing African people. So let's talk about what that looks like. In the 60s and 70s, Africa was ablaze with armed anti-colonial struggles. It had been colonized for a century. The African people were tired of it. They rose up, and nation after nation took up arms, formed mass organizations, and fought back against European colonialism. One really important fact to understand is that the European powers that make up NATO, forces like Belgium, forces like Germany, forces like Britain, France, Portugal, those are all the colonizers of Africa. The NATO coalition is made up of Africa's colonizers. And when NATO formed as a military alliance, NATO went immediately to work to fight back against anti-colonial struggles on the continent. So Portugal is, in comparison to the rest of Europe, a pretty underdeveloped country. Even at the time when it was maintaining colonial holds in Africa in many, many places, Portugal was still much poorer and much less developed than other European powers. So Portugal's membership in NATO allowed them to repress these anti-colonial struggles. And to understand what that means, I want to read a quote from Amilcar Cabral. He is the founder of the PAIGC, which is the African People's Organization that fought against Portuguese colonialism in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. There were also Portuguese colonies in Mozambique and Angola, which he's going to talk about. So Cabral says, "You see, Portugal is an underdeveloped country, the most backward in Western Europe. It is a country that doesn't even produce toy planes. This is not a joke, it's true. Portugal would never be able to launch 3 colonial wars in Africa without the help of NATO, the weapons of NATO, the planes of NATO, the bombs of NATO. It would be impossible for them. This is not a matter of discussion. The Americans knew it, the British know it, the French know it very well, the West Germans also know it, and the Portuguese also know it very well." So what Cabral is saying right there is that if Portugal had to maintain the counter-revolutionary resistance to anti-colonial struggles in its colonies, Portugal could not have done that. They would have been defeated immediately. The only way that Portugal was able to put up a fight in 3 separate African nations was because NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was arming them to repress African people fighting for their land back. And if there you can read a little bit about the history of why this happened. And there's a conversation in Return to the Source where Amilcar Cabral recounts asking a U.S. ambassador, why is the U.S. backing up Portugal to repress African struggles? What is the point of this? And the ambassador is well, Portugal allows us to use the Azores, which are islands off the coast of Portugal, for military purposes. So we want to keep doing that, and so we're helping Portugal kill you so we can keep using the Azores. But Cabral goes on to say, that's clearly only part of the reason. The real reason was about maintaining Western dominance of Africa and its resources, which of course was in the interest of U.S. capitalism, because the entire foundation of capitalism in the United States and capitalism throughout the world is the exploitation of Africa's land and resources. That's why they wanted to fight back against anti-colonial struggles. Another example of how NATO has shown up in a counter-revolutionary way in Africa is the example of NATO's relations with the reactionary settler government of Azania. Azania is the name that African people have given South Africa. South Africa is one of the oldest settler colonies on the planet. European settlers still own the majority of the land in South Africa, but in the 70s and 80s, an anti-colonial struggle was waged by Africans in Azania who were attempting to fight for their land back. So one really important thing to understand is that from the very beginning, the illegal settler government of South Africa, the Europeans that stole African land, considered themselves to be a part of the West, even though they were in Africa. And so from the very beginning, the reactionary settler government was aligned with NATO. In 1955, NATO and the Europeans that stole African land in Azania formed what was known as the Simonstown Agreement. And what that agreement allowed was for NATO and the South African apartheid military to spy on anti-colonial struggles across the entire continent. It also created a defense pact that allowed NATO, in partnership with the South African apartheid military, to repress those anti-colonial struggles. So these Europeans stole people's land and then formed a partnership with the reactionary white supremacist alliance of imperialists to make sure that African people could not fight for their land back by spying on them and repressing them. Additionally, in the mid-1970s, when the armed struggle in Southern Africa was at its height and the Africans were making great advances thanks to the help of forces like Cuba and the USSR, the reactionary settler government of South Africa received supplies to develop nuclear weapons from both NATO and Israel. Again, they were fighting Africans who were just trying to get their land back. And NATO and the illegal settler state of Israel armed the settler regime in Azania with the materials they needed to develop nuclear weapons so they could use those weapons as a threat against the Africans fighting colonization. This is just an example of NATO's reactionary legacy in Africa, directly fighting against liberation movements. And then this brings us to probably like one of the most recent examples of NATO's reactionary nature on the continent. It is not defensive. It is not interested in humanitarian interests. And the 2011 US and NATO-led invasion of Libya is a very, very clear example of this. So in 2011, the United Nations issued Resolution 1973, which gave authorization to form a no-fly zone over Libya, as well as to start up a blockade. The reason given for the implementation of this no-fly zone was to protect citizens. But when the US-led NATO forces launched their bombing campaign in Libya, the result was the deaths of tens of thousands of civilians, the destruction of tens of billions of dollars worth of property and infrastructure, and the complete devastation of what had been, up until that point, one of Africa's most prosperous countries with one of the highest standards of living on the continent. After the fact, President Barack Obama called Libya one of his greatest mistakes, the biggest mistake of his administration. But at that point, the damage had been done. As I said, tens of thousands of African civilians in Libya were murdered as a result of NATO intervention. Gaddafi was lynched in the street in a publicly aired video that Hillary Clinton laughed at. And Libya became a failed state where right now, as we speak, there are open air slave markets where African people attempting to get to Europe to escape the conditions that imperialism created on the continent are literally bought and sold. The US and NATO sold the invasion of Libya as a humanitarian intervention, but it's very important to understand that the West, the capitalist imperialist empires, do not care about any kind of humanitarian cause. What it was really about is that US imperialism and NATO powers cannot accept any country that decides to be an independent force outside of their sphere of influence. They want to make sure that African nations remain submissive, remain subjugated, and allow their resources to be exploited and their people to be exploited. And that is why the invasion of Libya happened. So in the modern day, NATO's influence in Africa lives on in the form of the US military's Africa Command, also known as AFRICOM. AFRICOM is a direct product of NATO via EUCOM, which is the US military's European command. Before AFRICOM existed, EUCOM was a central part of NATO and originally took responsibility for 42 African states. That responsibility has now been transferred to AFRICOM. AFRICOM's stated purpose is to fight terrorism on the African continent, but since AFRICOM has been in place, terrorism in Africa went from a phenomenon that was isolated in a handful of nations to a transnational threat. It is by every measure much worse since the introduction of AFRICOM. AFRICOM has also led to a drastic increase of coups carried out by soldiers who have been trained by AFRICOM and by NATO. It has also led to widespread civilian casualties thanks to drone warfare that has tons of collateral damage, as well as so-called counterterrorism operations that devastate civilian areas. And so, as Cabral and Walter Rodney and Kwame Nkrumah warned us in the 60s and 70s, NATO continues today in the form of AFRICOM to facilitate wars, instability, and the looting and destruction of Africa. And that's where I'm going to wrap it up. Oh, and so just to reiterate the original starting point, we have to understand that NATO is not a defensive alliance. NATO is not a progressive or neutral force. NATO is a genocidal, white supremacist military alliance of imperialists that seeks to maintain Western dominance over Africa and the entire global South. We must oppose NATO expansion on any grounds in any part of the world, and we must call for AFRICOM and NATO out of Africa now. And so to talk about another dark chapter in the history of NATO's relations with the world, I'm going to pass it to Dr. Charisse Burton-Stelly to talk about how capitalism and imperialism have historically aligned with Nazism and fascism.
Good evening, everyone. I am so glad to be here. I am going to try mightily to stick within this 10 minutes. I do not have a PowerPoint because I'm technologically inept, but I will be reading from some sources because I am a consummate scholar and academic. And so I just want to first start off by reaffirming that the US is arming neo-Nazis, and they know they are doing it. They have known since at least 2015. So on June 10, 2015, the US House of Representatives approved a bipartisan amendment to the Defense Appropriations Act from Representatives John Conyers Jr. and Ted Yoho that will block US training of the Azov Battalion and would prevent further transfer of shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles to fighters in Ukraine as well as in Iraq. So the Azov Battalion was described as a 1,000-man volunteer militia of the Ukrainian National Guard that was openly neo-Nazi and fascist. And they were not some obscure force. Ukraine's Interior Minister Arsen Avakov, who oversaw Ukraine's armed militias, announced that Azov troops would be among the first units to be trained by who? The 300 US military advisors who were dispatched to Ukraine in a training mission codenamed Fearless Guardian. So this was back in 2015. Interestingly, later under pressure from the Pentagon in December 2015, that amendment barring the funding to Azov was removed from the 2016 House Defense Appropriations Act. So even as it was acknowledged that this neo-Nazi force is being funded, the Pentagon was like, nah, run it back. We need to have latitude to fund them. Even the conservative London Daily Telegraph described the recently formed battalions in Donbass, such as the Dnipro and Azov, as having several thousand men under their command, and they were officially under the control of the Interior Ministry, but they had murky financing and their training was inadequate and the ideology was alarming. So these were men who wore the neo-Nazi wolf's angel symbol on their banner, and also members of the battalion were openly white supremacist or anti-Semitic. And these fighters doubted the reality of the Holocaust, expressed admiration for Adolf Hitler, and acknowledged that they were indeed Nazis. And despite the newsworthiness of US-backed government dispatching Nazi stormtroopers to attack Ukrainian citizens in cities, major US news outlets have actually tried to cover up this fact or normalize or legitimate this fact. For example, the Washington Post published a piece that rationalized the Azov's use of the swastika as just romantic, right? As a celebration of the past. And so even though there are blatant neo-Nazis in the coup regimes, in the post-coup regime, so one of which is Andrei Parubi, so I'm butchering the name, but it's Andrei Parubi. He was the first national security chief, despite the fact that these neo-Nazi formations are not fringe, they're incorporated into the military, they also have a small presence in the regime. The US state apparatus, including the media, is doing everything they can to either cover this up or to provide a counter narrative, which should be very, 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 very alarming. Because if they're doing this to Ukrainians, what do you think they're going to do to the historical internal enemies? And so I'm going to get to that in just a second. And so part of what I want to talk about is sort of 10 reasons why the US is able to fund these neo-Nazis currently with impunity, right? Because of their investment in capitalist imperialism and because of their deep anti-socialism and anti-communism. And so the first 3 reasons have to do with the internal foundations of the United States. One is anti-Black racism, one is the anti-Indigenous settler colonial foundations, and another is the anti-radical state apparatus. So in terms of anti-Black racism, what we know is that all of the elements of fascism, all of the elements of Nazism, that is suppression of freedom, appeal to tradition, and rigid legal economic imposition along racial lines were inscribed in Jim Crow, right? Throughout the US South, but also in the North, Black people were subjected to anti-Black violence, white supremacist violence, including race riots, lynchings, quote unquote, legal lynchings, where they would be subjected to trumped up charges. And we see the expansion or the residues of Jim Crow today in things like the prison industrial complex. And so the US is not hostile to these policies and practices. Indeed, and in fact, they are very familiar. They're very legible. And indeed, they are very compatible with the way the US runs its own state. Second is the anti-Indigenous foundations and the realities of internal imperialism, what we also call settler colonialism. So I just want to read a little bit from this book called The American West and the Nazi East, a comparative and interpretive perspective here. And so what it says is that essentially it's arguing that Hitler got a lot of his policy from historical US policies against Native people. So it says, in private conversations during the Second World War, German leader Adolf Hitler frequently compared the German war for Lebensraum, that is living space in the East, to the colonial wars waged by the 19th century Euro-American great powers. The Slavic world, he believed, had to be conquered and colonized and its population vanquished. Completion of this colonizing mission inevitably demanded the destruction of the natives as a result of methods similar to those used in the conquest of the American West. In a monologue to his close associates, Hitler declared, quote, "There is only one duty, to Germanize the East by the immigration of Germans and to look upon the natives as redskins," end quote. He also compared the quelling of partisan resistance in the wild East to the quote, "struggle in North America against the Red Indians," end quote. According to his understanding, the American Nordics had colonized the West after they had shot down the millions of, quote, redskins to a few 100,000, end quote. He went on to say that here in the East, a similar process will repeat itself for a second time as in the conquest of America. So not only is he looking to the US for guidance, this is something that is celebrated. And so it is a sort of feedback loop. The US is not exactly hostile to fascism, and fascist regimes were looking to the United States for its its horrible violence against racialized people to implement its own regime. And we see this feedback loop over and over. So again, this book is The American West and the Nazi East. Okay, thirdly is the anti-radical state apparatus. What we have to know is that from the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the US has passed a bevy of legislation. And I'm gonna read through just some of them in a second, but the other thing we need to understand is that this is a collaboration between all three branches of government: the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. And it also happens at the state and local levels. But from 1917, just a sample of some of these sort of committees and legislation passed by the legislative branch of the US government that are anti-radical were the Overman Subcommittee of the Committee on the Judiciary, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, the Subversive Activities Control Board, the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, I am sweating, somebody put that in the chat, and a litany of legislation like the 1917 Espionage Act and the 1918 Sedition Act, the 1938 Foreign Agents Registration Act, the 1939 Hatch Act, the 1940 Voorhees Act, the 1940 Alien Registration Act, the 1947 Labor Management Relations Act, and the Internal Security Act of 1950, as well as the 1954 Communist Control Act. And so this is just the anti-radical legislation, basically between World War I and the early Cold War. There's many, many, many more. So out of the convergence of these three, anti-Indigenous policy, anti-Black racism, and the anti-radical state apparatus, we see the US doing a whole bunch of goofy shit, right? In the 1920s, all of the top American businessmen were supportive of Mussolini. Okay, so top American businessmen saw Benito Mussolini's leadership as a model for moments of crisis that had turned back the threat of socialist revolution in Europe. They saw him as restoring the ideals of individualism, the inviolable right of private property and contract, law and order and private management. They argued that fascism had ended the strike wave and prevented the communists from gaining political ground, and that Mussolini's fascist victory over communism, which they called an evil disease from the Orient, had captured their imaginations, right? And so Mussolini was praised for his pragmatism and realism. I could go on and on, but I will just know that they really love Mussolini. They liked Hitler fine, but they were really, really supportive of Mussolini. The next example, between 1934 and 1935, there was a committee convened called the Special Committee on Un-American Activities that was authorized to investigate Nazi propaganda and certain other propaganda activities. This is colloquially known as the McCormick-Dickenstein Committee. And this was the precursor to the House Committee on Un-American Activities. What's really important about this committee essentially is that it was organized to fight fascism, but all of those resources went to investigate communism and to fight supposed communist subversion. And this was despite the fact that they actually had uncovered a fascist plot to seize the White House and oust Franklin Roosevelt from power. And these were fascist business leaders in connection with some overseas European fascists. So despite the fact that this was the reality, they spent most of their resources investigating communists. And so this is the link between the US support for communism and Nazism and anti-communism. So fascism is much more amenable to the way the US organizes its society than is socialism. And often the embrace of fascism and neo-Nazism is meant to shore up its anti-communist forces. So in 1935 and 1936, US companies like Ford, General Motors, and Texas Oil Company sent supplies to fascist Franco in the Spanish Civil War and to Mussolini for his invasion of Abyssinia in 1935. And so even though ostensibly there was a neutrality pact, these private corporations, these large corporations were funding these fascist forces. Another aspect of this is that after the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939, which Jackie talked about, the US came up with this conceptual framework of red fascism. This is when they start talking about authoritarianism and totalitarianism in ways that linked communism and fascism. And one of the reasons why they did this was that they could ostensibly be fighting fascism or critiquing fascism only by targeting communism. And so by suturing them in like the popular imaginary, what they were really doing was kind of allowing fascism to seep in through the back door, including its US varieties like the KKK, while vehemently attacking and repressing communism internally and abroad. Another aspect that Jackie touched on that it manifests US support of fascism for the purposes of anti-communism is the Marshall Plan. Now, what's really important about the Marshall Plan is that no country could receive aid if they elected a communist government. Likewise, the US, part of the reason the US implemented the Marshall Plan was to make Europe not only buy US goods, but to also rearm themselves for war. So in the war, this was especially the case after the sort of launch of the Vietnam War, which I'm going to talk about in a second. The Marshall Plan also funded a whole bunch of, I'm going to read this part quickly from the book Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. And so it says, for decades, US leaders have done their part in keeping Italian fascism alive. From 1945 to 1975, US government agencies gave an estimated $75 million to right-wing organizations in Italy, including some with close ties to the neo-fascist Movimento Sociale Italiano. Alongside this, hundreds of Nazi war criminals found a haven in the United States, either living in comfortable anonymity or are actively employed by US intelligence agencies during the Cold War and otherwise enjoying the protection of high-placed individuals. Some of them found their ways onto the Republican presidential campaign committees of Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George Bush. So not only are they here, they were incorporated into the upper echelons of power. I'm going to wrap up with just two more points. In 1950, just a few weeks after the outbreak of the Korean War, the United States ordered France to accept the rapid rearmament of the Federal Republic of Germany, that West Germany, because they were increasingly afraid that the Soviet Union, which had nuclear capability, would launch an offensive military campaign in Western Europe. They had just fought this war with these people. France was still largely traumatized by the Nazi takeover by the Germans, and yet the US was rushing to rearm these people who had just mere years ago been their mortal enemies, to stave off the USSR and communism. And interestingly, member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, were also in favor of German rearmament, with the exception of the French and the Belgian governments. And this has striking parallels to today, because prior to this, this conflict in Ukraine, France was talking about needing autonomy from the US and carving out its own sphere of influence, but folded like a lawn chair and fell right in line once this conflict was launched. And so it's a similar display of how the US really dominates NATO and imposes its will through NATO and on NATO organizations. The last example is the way that the US backed apartheid in South Africa. Onya talked about this, but specifically for the purposes of shoring up an anti-communist front on the African continent. And so I'm going to read a little bit from just this little pamphlet. It's called Against Fascist Enslavement in South Africa. It was prepared by the African National Congress. So on page 45, it says that in sentencing African and Indian leaders under the Suppression of Communism Act, the magistrate basically ruled that breaking down race barriers was communism. And so anybody who struggled against apartheid racism was a communist, right? And because communists stood for anti-racism. And so by this ruling, anyone who advocated the end of race discrimination was a communist and liable to prosecution and a period of up to 10 years of imprisonment. And then that Suppression of Communism Act was passed in 1950. Likewise, it was agreed by the US government and the South African government alike that the US was reticent to castigate or move away from South Africa because it needed a hub of anti-communism on the continent, not only to protect its sort of mineral interests and its resource interests, but also to make sure that the continent stayed in the orbit of the West for geostrategic reasons, as well as economic. So this is just, these are kind of like the first half of the 20th century examples. These go on and on and on. And these tactics to stave off communism continue on through the US funding, religious fundamental groups in places like Afghanistan, and we see the effects of that today. So there's kind of a seamless transition, right? That they're willing to fund and back any and everyone who is willing to struggle against communism and socialism. And this is the foundation of why it is that the US effortlessly and seamlessly funds neo-Nazis and will continue to do so with grave consequences for racialized and colonized people. That was way over 10 minutes. I am so sorry, but I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. CBS. But also for to Oni, to Jackie, let's all give them some love and offer them some praise for the amazing knowledge, the historical context that they all provided. There obviously there's just so much to unpack, and we didn't want to cut anybody off because this is all vital information for all of us to continue to learn and unlearn the different pieces. Imperialism and war and like what we hear in our society. So thank you to each of you. I do want to share before we go into our next component that we may be going over our agenda time. So that means we may go over our time of 8 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, just a little bit, because we don't want to cut anybody off, because there's some rich conversations happening here, and we do want to make sure that we also offer space at the end for you all to ask any questions. Oni earlier in the chat dropped in that if there are any particular questions that you guys want us to start preparing and have lined up, please do drop those in the chat. But yes, I am going to go ahead and pass it over to Jen Marley with the Red Nation, who is now going to go over sanctions and extractivisms.
Thank you, Reyes. Good evening, everybody. Sengiku Namikema, Naakawa Jennifer Marley, Bohogeo Winge, Iweri Omu. My name is Jennifer Marley, and I'm from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso, and I'm also with the Red Nation. I do ask you to bear with me as I'm like pretty sick right now, so my voice is not really sounding great, and my mind is a little bit everywhere. But yeah, let's get into it. Are the slides there?
Yep, they're up.
Okay,
the
cool.
first one.
Okay, cool. Let's go ahead and go to the next one. So yeah, this is titled Sanctions, Extraction, and Imperialism, US Out of Everywhere. And this graphic here is what we included with our statement on the conflict in Ukraine. And let's get into it. Next slide, please. So we wanted to start here in the context of the so-called United States, or what some people call Turtle Island. And I actually teach a class called US War on Terror, where I kind of map out the origins of the War on Terror and locate it as beginning with Indigenous people here in North America. And so that's why we say Indigenous people are the original insurgents. And that goes for here in Turtle Island, but really everywhere. So the war that is waged on Native nations is the original imperial war. It was wars against Indigenous people that really created the foundation of imperialism, and specifically US imperialism that we've been talking about. And we know that Natives were domesticated, quotes, right? through settler law and policy like the Marshall Trilogy, which changed the status of Native nations from foreign nations to colonized subjects of the US. And we're now referred to in policy as domestic dependent nations. And I think this could really, I want to draw parallels between that status of domestic dependent and the way the US and Western powers force a dependent relationship between themselves and other colonized nations and other nations in the global South, which, as we just learned about, are constantly being underdeveloped and attacked anytime they try to resist and assert their own sovereignty. And that is what continues to happen to Native nations here today. So the settling of the American West was an imperial project to consolidate US territory by winning the Indian Wars, starving Native people, and dismantling Native nationhood. And we see that moving forward, these strategies just continue to grow and develop and build upon themselves. And so anyone can be made into the figure of the Indian. Anyone can be deemed an insurgent or a terrorist, right? We've seen it applied to different people over the years, to Chinese people during the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act, to Black and African folks, to Arab people, to migrants from Mexico and South America. We see this this figure of the insurgent come out again and again as the war on terror, the quote war on terror continues. And one of the major examples of this is that in the operation to kill Osama bin Laden was codenamed Geronimo because he was notoriously hard to kill, as Geronimo was, is what they say. So our struggles for anti-colonial sovereignty, self-determination, and nationhood have always been anti-imperial projects. Anytime colonized people defend themselves, it is anti-imperial, right? Next slide, please. So I'm gonna hone in on the Southwest, which is where most of us are located right now, just to give an example of how resource extraction plays out and what it does. I want to start by talking about the nuclear industrial complex. It was born on Tewa lands. It was born on my Pueblo's homeland specifically, and literally in a sacred site. And to this day, the nuclear industrial complex remains the heart of US imperial power, the heart of US military power. And we've seen the way that nuclear weapons have been used to threaten people throughout the world, right, by Western powers. And so we say that Tewa people were the first victims of nuclearism, and along with really everybody here in New Mexico, because the Trinity test took place in the Tularosa Basin in 1945 in southern New Mexico, and that test has impacted this entire region to this day. We know that there's hundreds of open uranium mines that still have not been cleaned all across the Navajo Nation. And one of the largest uranium tailing spills took place in Church Rock near Fort Wingate, which is about 40 miles west of here. And that spill was so harmful that it's comparable to the Chernobyl meltdown, which the US loves to sensationalize as like a big screw up, but really we have no way of knowing whether the Church Rock spill was actually worse, because the standards for measuring radiation only goes as high as what was picked up for the Chernobyl spill. So the US has refused to clean that up. It still has not been cleaned. The land and people are still suffering from that. And we also know that New Mexico is a hot spot for coal, gas, and natural oil extraction. And then specifically, the Navajo Nation has been targeted for extraction over the years. The Navajo Generating Station was named the third largest producer of coal for the US at one time. I believe it's closed since. But here in the Four Corners area, we still have mass fracking, so much so that the methane cloud that exists from this fracking over New Mexico can be seen from space. NASA has photographed it, and those are available for the public to see. But fracking, as we know, is extremely harmful to the land and all of the non-human relatives on the land. It contaminates the groundwater. It can cause earthquakes and land fractures. It pollutes the land, air, and water, and the animals that live on it, making it almost impossible to live on, right? And here in New Mexico, there's policy being proposed that would sell produced water back to people and incorporate it into municipal water systems. And what produced water is it's water that is it's left over from the fracking process. So in the fracking process, they shoot water into the ground to break up the earth to retrieve the oil. And they're proposing that this water, imbued with chemicals that they're not even legally obliged to say what they are, be incorporated back into public water systems. So that's just like to give you an example of what it's like here. And it's not just here, right? Next slide. yeah, so just what's happening here in terms of resource extraction is just one example close to home. But as we know, the US and Europe continue to underdevelop the rest of the world by stealing natural and abundant resources, especially in the global South. In South America and Africa and Asia, they continue to be targeted for extraction. Yet the wealth generated from these projects does not benefit the people who live where they take place. Extraction projects serve imperialism by forcing a dependent relationship with imperialist powers. Like I said, much like the way the US forced native nations to become domestic dependent nations. And as my comrades before me laid out very clearly, it's also about geopolitical power. It's about manipulating economies, and it's about displacing people, right? Next slide, please. And so, and this is just kind of like a prelude to talking about how sanctions on Russia are going to impact extraction here. But December 2015, Obama signed into law HR 229, which basically means that was basically on he campaigned on making so that the US could be dependent on domestic oil, and the US wouldn't have to purchase oil from any other countries. And this is why the fracking boom happened here in New Mexico. But what they don't tell you is that this was actually a lead up to the coup in Venezuela, the attempted coup in Venezuela, where they put sanctions on Venezuela, also Iran, so that, you know, we were no longer purchasing their oil. And so, in short, as I kind of sum up later, sanctions abroad mean extraction here. And when extraction here happens, it's almost always native lands that are targeted. Not just for extraction, but also militarization, right? Like the creation of bombs. Like I saw someone mention silos. There are silos here. There's actually 15 intercontinental ballistic missiles that sit like 15 miles from where I'm at right now. It's pretty unsettling. And so Biden has since expanded the leasing of land permits to multinational gas and oil corporations. Next slide, please. All right, so what are sanctions? So I pulled heavily from the AAPRP slideshow on this because it's just so on point and it's so concise. So sanctions are economic restrictions that one country or a coalition of countries put on another country and its citizens. Reasons for sanctions can range from attempting to change the behavior of a country, efforts to nationalize resources, which is what happened in Bolivia, right? They tried to nationalize their resources and then they attempted a coup, but then the coup failed. Or forcing the implementation of austerity measures like in Iran or Libya, which we just learned about, and the end result was horrific. To attempts at regime change, like in Cuba or Venezuela. Next slide, please. So who gets sanctioned? 1/3 of the Earth's population, 1/3. And just like, that's just a huge scale, right? And here's some of the countries listed that are currently sanctioned right now, that currently have sanctions on them. Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Somalia, Libya, Sudan, Democratic Republic of the Congo. Like, so it just goes on. And as we see, the US and NATO, had no problem putting sanctions on a country as huge as Russia, right? Where we know that it's going to be everyday people that get hit the hardest. And the language that we've been seeing in media, popular discourse, is that they're targeted sanctions, which is just like hilarious to me, because they're trying to convince, the public that these sanctions are going to target the, Russian oligarchs and the people in power. But really, it's everyday people, poor working class people who are getting hit the hardest and who are getting hit first. Next slide, please. So right here, here's a picture of, this is a recent picture from about 2 weeks ago in Russia, where Apple and Cash App pulled their services from the entire country. And so suddenly you have people being forced back to a cash-only economy overnight. And this is people fumbling for cash, just trying to get on the train, everyday public transportation. And so as we can see, it's not hitting, sanctions don't work, right? Essentially sanctions, they don't work to do what they're proposed to do. But they do work to maintain imperialist power and violence in certain places, right? So the United States, the European Union, and the United Nations impose the vast majority of the world's sanctions. And that's what we're seeing today with Russia. Next slide, please. So how do sanctions work? So here we got the mechanism. The US, European Union, United Nations pass laws to ban or restrict trade to a specific country or group or individuals when they do not comply with US, EU foreign policy. So basically anyone who's not operating in the interest of these imperial powers can be subjected to sanctions. Currencies are devalued and inflated, international credit ratings tank, and countries who are involved are pressured to stop doing business with targeted countries. And if they don't comply, they'll get sanctioned too. And so that's why you see a lot of countries that are sanctioned working amongst themselves. And the consequences end up being that the first sectors of an economy are affected by sanctions are usually medicines, cost of food, power, water treatment, and other things essential for human survival, because the West and the United States specifically holds trade, banking, and military dominance over most of the world, right? Thanks colonialism. Sanctions have killed millions of vulnerable people. Next slide, please. And that's why we say sanctions are worse than guns and, or not worse, but they're as bad as guns and bombs. And I just want to read a statement real quick, or a sentence from our position statement, but it's basically talking about how a special advisor to Joe Biden, John Gonzalez, stated that the sanctions on Russia are so robust that they will have an impact on those governments that have economic affiliations with Russia, and that is by design. Venezuela will begin to feel that pressure. Nicaragua will feel that pressure, as will Cuba. So they're very aware that these sanctions aren't just going to impact Russia, but everybody looking to delink themselves from the global capitalist chain. And so, and it's also important to remember that even according to the UN's own laws, sanctions are in violation of them. Sanctions violate the UN Charter and the Geneva and Nuremberg Conventions because they deliberately target civilians through economic strangulation, creating famines, life-threatening shortages, and economic chaos. And this is intentional. The goal is that eventually the people of sanctioned nations will overthrow their own governments. And that's fed to us through media. Like I don't know how many people remember last year, US media outlets were really publicizing protests in Cuba that were supposedly anti-government protests. They were really blown out of proportion, and it was to say that Cuba was failing their people during COVID. But really what was happening is that sanctions were strangling them, and they still did a better job of protecting their people from COVID than here in the United States, in spite of the embargo. Next one, please. So sanctions are acts of war. When the US put the, quote, mother of all sanctions on Russia, which is what they called it, it escalated the crisis in Ukraine exponentially. And it's not every day sanctions are put on powers as big as Russia. The US is telling European countries that they will supplement Russian oil that many European nations were dependent on with US domestic oil. So this means more extraction from native lands. And like I said, Biden has increased the approval of leasing permits. Just as we saw in Venezuela, more sanctions there mean more extraction here. And I just wanted to end by reading a quote from my comrade Nick. And he said, "The US has all but declared war on Russia. Its goal is to sever Europe from Russian energy using Atlantic shipping lanes to feed Europe with North American fossil fuels. The US pushed oil and gas pipelines through indigenous territories for a reason. When the US hails the sanctity of Ukrainian sovereignty, it has prepared for war with it has prepared for war with Russia by violating indigenous sovereignty. Expanding US carbon infrastructure with the strategic aim of supplying Europe with fossil fuels once it's cut off from Russian energy. Next slide, please. So this is just, yeah, this is where I wanted to end. I saw like a lot of amazing questions that I want to address too, but for the sake of time, I'll wait till the Q&A. But yeah, dismantle NATO, no war, no sanctions, US out of everywhere. And these are our demands because imperialist violence elsewhere always comes back home, right? And that's what I always tell people about the nature of the quote war on terror too, is that violence always comes back home and it falls on US citizens and it falls on indigenous people here. And this is why we must oppose imperialist wars at all costs, at all turns, and understand that the US and NATO forces have such, like, there's such an extreme power imbalance. And when people try to claim that, you know, like Russia and the US are like just as bad in terms of imperialist power, like that is clearly false from everything we've seen here. So yeah, I'm gonna end it there and pass it back to Reyes. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for, you know, that context. I think every time I hear about sanctions, you know, it just pisses me off a little bit more and more. And that's putting it lightly. But thank you so much for your knowledge and you just really breaking all of that down. And just real briefly, you know, I want to just expand on what Jen said too, in terms of like sanctions here means more extractions here, and how she was talking about Biden, and that means that there's going to be more land extraction, more extractive colonialism happening within our land bases, which is directly an attack on our sacred ancestral spaces that both Pueblo and Dene people have connection to in the greater Chaco region, when we're already, I believe the space is 96% of it is already leased out to oil and gas companies. And we already have that methane cloud that sits there. So, you know, we just got to keep doing the work to keep pushing all of that back. And yeah, I just felt that, you know, it, unfortunately, you know, it's just all this, like, it's like this full circle, all of these ways that it intersects. So thank you, Jen, again. What I would like to do now is I want to push us into a different type of way that we can, you know, shift the conversation and, you know, well, what do we do now? You know, all of the presenters from Keegan to Oni, Dr. CBS, Jackie and Jen, you know, they've all given us a lot of knowledge. And I'm sure all of us, you know, are sitting here thinking, okay, I have all this information now. So what can I do? You know, what steps can we take from here? Because it's important that we're not just educating you all, but also providing you all some tools and resources so that way you all can continue to take action beyond this space that we're all collectively in at this moment. So what I would like to do is we're going to pass it off to all the presenters. We're going to start with Keegan, but each presenter is going to have the opportunity to share about some ways that they think that could be like a next step in, you know, what we can do now. And we also want to acknowledge too that we know that these are not just like the final and only solutions. We acknowledge that there are many different ways that we can take these approaches, but, you know, we hope that you, you know, listen and, you know, we can contribute to the conversation as we continue to go as well, especially because we have like a Q&A and we're going to share some other ways that you can also continue to take action. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Keegan.
Awesome, thanks, Reyes. Yeah, I'll be real brief. I think I just want to ask folks to be really critical of the media that you're engaging with. As we've heard, like there are so many things that are painted in extremely broad strokes or completely either manipulated or not even talked about. Yeah, Dr. Zivich said lies, like straight up lies. So like, let's be really intentional about engaging with media and then talking with other people in our lives about that and saying why when people are like, oh, we should definitely sanction that country, it'll be okay. It won't be okay. And then, yeah, that's all that I have. I'll pass it to Omi.
I think Jackie's actually first. If Jackie would like to go, and then I'll go. Or not, I can go. Okay, so in terms of like what we should do next, let me see if I can spotlight myself so you can see me. Hello. In terms of what we should do next, so as we laid out in this presentation, US imperialism, NATO power imperialism are like the dominant forces for exploitation and oppression on this planet. We are people living in the belly of the beast, those of us in the United States. I also saw in the chat that there are folks joining us from Europe, folks joining us from all over the world. And so we have to understand that like as citizens of empire, we have a responsibility to play our position. We have to organize a truly anti-imperialist movement that unites struggles across identities, across issues to oppose imperialism. We have to understand that the primary force for injustice on this planet today is the nature of capitalism to exploit, to steal, and to destroy. And if we want to stop that process, if we want to stop the colonization of Africa, if we want to stop the acceleration toward nuclear war in Eastern Europe, if we want to stop the devastation of the Earth's resources and this acceleration towards catastrophic climate change, it's going to require taking out the capitalist system. And in order to take out the capitalist system, we are going to have to organize a mass movement. So in order to do that, each of us who are interested in fighting for justice, each of us that believes a better world is possible, is going to have to join an organization. You're going to have to join an organization fighting back against imperialism, join an organization fighting back against capitalism and colonization, join an organization fighting for socialism or anarchism if you're into it. But either way, join an organization fighting for justice. Help us build this mass movement that can actually contend for power to build a system that's actually based on life and equality for all living beings on this planet. That is the most important thing we can do. And the second thing we have to do is that folks have like learned a lot from this presentation. I see your comments in the chat. It's very energizing to know that we are successfully conveying this information and like sharing stuff with y'all that maybe you didn't know before you got here. And so a very, very good first step is to start to have conversations with your friends and family about the things you learned today. And it's like super awkward at first when you're like anti-imperialist and communist and you're like trying to talk to your grandma, your sister, and they're like, what are you talking about? It's very uncomfortable at first, but we have to get comfortable having these conversations with as many people as possible in language that they can understand. And if you join a political organization that has political education, then you develop the skills to do it much more easily. So that's like another bonus for joining an organization. But either way, talk to your family, talk to your friends, talk to your coworkers, your comrades about what you learned here today. Help us develop this mass movement to take out imperialism. And also please, please, please join an organization fighting for justice. And now I will pass it to Jackie if Jackie is ready.
I apologize, I had to step away. Yeah, so next practical steps, we laid out for you the definition of terms that people like to throw around all the time. That kind of annoys me in these conversations. And that's the thing that makes these conversations difficult and awkward, I think, because we use terms, we don't know what they mean, and we have a hard time defining them to other people. So we made that part easy for you. So, if people are asking you, well, what is imperialism? You can share this video, you can give this information to people. But I think one of the things, practical things, and it's the one thing that I find that people find the least enjoyable thing to do, but it benefits you more than you would, you've got to read. You have to read. You've got to read some history, you've got to read some theory, you've got to read, the history of struggle, how people carried through with struggling for socialism and communism, and the price they paid in this imperialist world to do that. I mean, there is a price to pay, which says to me that if so many people around the world are willing to struggle for this thing, and pay such high prices to realize it, with their lives, with, struggling for the sovereignty of their revolutionary processes in their countries still, I feel like, at least for me, then that means this thing it's two things. It is threatening to the power structure, at the existing power structure. Socialism and communism are threats to the capitalist imperialist power structure. And because it's a threat to the power structure, then I want it. So I think the most practical thing I can tell you to do is start reading those texts that seem really intimidating. Yes, read Das Kapital, read the Communist Manifesto, read the Little Red Book, but also read books about African scientific socialist African revolutionaries and revolutionaries from the global South, and read. Because that really does help you formulate in your mind really what it is you are struggling for and why. And that helps you ground yourself in this struggle. And I have to sign on to what Anya said. All of this, it is easier to do in an organization. The great thing about organizations is a lot of times they have internal political education and reading clubs. That is extremely helpful to get you through these thick, dense texts that are difficult to understand on your own. So I think one of the most practical things that you can do is read. And I think the other practical thing to do is to understand what politicians and the talking heads are saying when they're talking to you. Follow the legislation that's being passed in the Congress of Millionaires. That it's important. I know Congressional Quarterly is boring, but you can get insight into what's actually in some of this legislation, the amount of money that is being thrown at warmongering and imperialism all over the world, as opposed to human and social needs here in this country. So for me, it's reading, joining an organization, and more reading.
And next we'll pass it to Dr. CBS for next steps.
Yes, I will keep it brief since I took up so much time earlier and everybody said mine. Obviously read, not only, I would say read, but not only read, but study, which also means like rereading and read collectively. For people, reading is hard for a lot of people. So I will also say consume other types of media like podcasts, documentaries, audiobooks. Audiobooks count as reading. And so study broadly, like there's lots of different study tools. But the more you do it, the easier it will be in terms of reading. Not only join an organization, but join a radical or revolutionary organization, a grassroots organization that is linking local, national, and global struggles. Embody the principles of your organization. So if you say that you are anti-prisons, don't engage carcerally with your comrades. If you are against patriarchy, don't be patriarching, and that's not reducible to like any gender, but you have to practice those principles because people have to want to be in those organizations. And then I would say just wage struggle where you're at. We're all at different places, right? And none of those places are expendable. People give academia a lot of flack. For example, I'm an academic, but Walter Rodney talks about being a guerrilla scholar and wage and struggle where you're at. And so we can flip a segment of the petty bourgeoisie. Like we know this, right? Fanon knew this, Cabral knew this. And so we have to wage struggle wherever we are. Even if you're at Arby's, wage struggle where you're at. And I also would say do the bare min. Like we're in a society where you have to work to live. Do the bare min. You don't owe these folks nothing. There's a difference between the job and the work. Save your energy for the work. Do the bare min at that job. That's what I say. And don't feel any shame in doing it because these people ain't got no loyalty to you. So those are my practical steps.
Thank you, Dr. CBS. We're going to go ahead and pass it off to Jen.
Thanks, Reyes. I can't agree more with what everybody has been saying. join an organization, read, educate yourself, study. This is what I'm always stressing to people. But to be specific, if you want a place to start with the Red Deal. The Red Deal was written by the Red Nation, but it was written by a collective of so many different community members. There's over 20 contributors ranging from youth to elders, people from all different backgrounds and professions. And what we do in the Red Deal, our goal is to lay out a plan for Indigenous action to save our Earth. And it's split into 3 parts. The first being divest and the occupation, which is about demilitarization everywhere. The second is heal our bodies and reinvest in our common humanity. So there we're talking about, how do we divest from these imperialist institutions and instead reinvest, all of that money back into things like sustainable housing, accessible education, adequate healthcare, better transportation infrastructure. How do we create better services for people fleeing gender, sexual, domestic violence? And then finally, heal our planet. That's about reinvesting in our common future. How do we create sustainable energy infrastructure? How do we revive traditional sustainable agriculture? And how do we continue to protect and restore sacred sites? So yeah, please check out the Red Deal if you haven't. It really just comes from the basis that the US military is the world's largest polluter, because it literally is. And if we care about climate change and reversing climate change and literally saving all life on Earth, we need to start by dismantling the US military. So check it out.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, everybody, for your your advice, what you're offering to everybody here right now. Definitely, I believe it's also important to make sure that it's like one step at a time, right? And I really want to uplift what Dr. CBS said too, in terms of like, don't fully exhaust your labor for corporations that really don't care about you. I also just want to uplift, making sure that we are also talking with our community members and making sure that we're engaging in this conversation as well. Let's not gatekeep the knowledge that we have all learned. Let's make sure that, at any point in time, we, break bread with relatives and community members to give them this information that, is much needed. And I think what I would like to also offer is that, debunk propaganda. I think one thing that I wanted to uplift a little bit earlier is that, it can be hard to debunk like the military and the propaganda that's been placed onto our peoples, because for Indigenous peoples, we have a lot of our own relatives that have served in the military, and it puts us in this weird complex of like, how do we engage in this conversation without like disrespecting our elders who have served, but also shifting the narrative of not letting our younger relatives, sacrifice themselves for the military in the US that really doesn't care about them at all. It's really important about like protecting our youth as well. And, just making sure that you're supporting other grassroots organizations. We know that doing this work is not easy. It exhausts, our labor, mentally, we're always exhausted of all of those different things. So if you are able to, donate to grassroots org, donate to anti-war, donate to, all these organizations that are here in this space, because we owe it, to each other, because we already all know, right, that the government and is not going to take care of us. And that's unfortunately been a lot of our relatives and community members are seeing that with their own eyes with the pandemic. And, through that pandemic, I just wanted to drop really quickly, Public Action Alliance has also created our own community defense campaign, which has come out of a lot of our mutual aid efforts, but it also includes pieces of like land back and water back and, protecting sacred entities, but then also, making sure that we learn how to like arm ourselves and defend our communities in the way that our ancestors did too, because really making sure that we're like looking to, indigenous perspectives and the way that they resisted as well too, because just as Jen said, like we have always been anti-imperialist, like we've always armed ourselves in a way that is going to protect, our what we have and like, the years of knowledge that have been passed on to us. So I just wanted to share that real quickly as well. But other next steps that we can continue to make sure that we all partake in is just like sharing the demands to de-escalate Ukraine, abolish NATO, and fund community, not war. Let's make sure, again, that kind of goes back to let's make sure that we're participating in other mutual aid efforts within our communities, because we're also seeing that, just because the pandemic, and we're opening up in different ways, that doesn't mean that there's a lot of trauma and things that we need to continue to heal and like learn how to continue to, be there for each other within these spaces as well. And so one of the other options that I want to make sure that we all let you know of too is that to participate in the Day of Action to Abolish NATO, which is going to be on Friday, March 25th. Let's make sure, that you are participating in this Day of Action virtually. You can film and post a short video on social media, use the hashtags de-escalate Ukraine and hashtag abolish NATO. Also talk about why we need to abolish NATO and why it's dangerous. Also uplifting, this video too, maybe we can drop this link somewhere as you're posting this video. I'm pretty sure majority of these organizations are going to upload them to like their YouTube channels or their websites. So, also take a selfie holding a message calling the world leaders to escalate Ukraine and abolish NATO, but also, be cautious of, security awareness, if you don't want, your face to be seen in these posts as well. Let's make sure, you're being cautious about that as well. But, maybe call your comrades, call your relatives to come together to maybe even do like a banner, do some art builds, because I know everybody, wants to contribute, but not necessarily feel, welcome to be in this space, because there's a lot to learn, there's a lot to unpack. But I feel like art builds and doing banners are always a good way to kind of, just be in space and also create opportunities for us to come together to continue to learn and grow in space with each other. So yeah. What I'm going to do now is I am going to pass it off to Oni, who is going to start us with the Q&A.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Reyes, for laying out those next steps, including the Day of Action to Abolish NATO next week on the 25th. We hope that you'll join us. Now is time for the Q&A section of the program. We are 6 minutes away from 8 o'clock, and we want to make sure that we don't have you here all night, even though it's a deep and rich conversation. We want to be respectful of folks' time. So we did get quite a few questions, which is very exciting, but we unfortunately won't have time for all of them. We will pick the spiciest ones, or I will. So first question, and this is for all of the speakers of the teach-in. So if you feel compelled to answer, then please do. So first question is, given the realities of what the US is now and the unlikelihood that we will see structural change / overthrow in the very short term, what action should we be advocating for the US to take towards Ukraine / Russia? Is Russia's invasion of Ukraine appropriate? Should we be defending it? If it isn't, what role should the US take in defending Ukrainian citizens? None? So that's the question. I'm going to put it in the chat. And it is floor is open for any of the teach-in facilitators to answer.
So that's a great question. And it's one that I encounter a lot. And there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of potential for distraction in that question, because people want to make Russia the bad guy and want to force people into this corner of do you support or defend Russia or not? I think that is a complete deflection of the actual issue. The issue is that we can't expect the country that was responsible for creating the situation to turn around and protect the people that they put in the situation in the first place, and that is the United States. So I don't expect the US to do anything to protect the Ukrainian people, that they literally installed a fascist government in Ukraine and let those fascists loose on the ethnic Russians in the eastern part of, Ukraine in an 8-year civil war. The US, EU, NATO axis of domination did that, not Russia. They did that in 2014. So for me, the only thing that I want from the US is to get the fuck out of Ukraine. I want the US to get out of everywhere. Actually, I want the US and EU and NATO. NATO needs to be disbanded. There never was a logical, reasonable use for it. NATO needs to be disbanded. The EU needs to get out of everywhere. The US needs to get out of everywhere. People's pursuit of their democratic processes and rights need to be respected, which did not happen in Ukraine when the people in the Crimean and Donbass regions voted to secede from Ukraine and rejoin the Russian Federation. The United States needs to stop telling people whose elections are valid and whose elections aren't valid when half of us can't even vote up in this piece because of gerrymandering. Whew, Lord. What I want from the US is to get out of everywhere. That ending US, EU, NATO domination is the solution to these issues of imperialism. That's the solution.
What the US can do for Ukrainian citizens is to take care of its own citizens. Because if the US actually was meeting the basic needs of just the bare minimum needs of anybody here, they wouldn't have no money to be funding wars. Because remember, this last 13.6 billion that went to Ukraine required that amount of COVID relief to be stripped from that bill. So this money doesn't come out of nowhere. Do y'all remember Build Back Better? Remember that thing? Remember that? That somehow that it went somewhere, who knows? And of course they blamed it on Cinema and Manchin and whomever, but that was, but there was no problem passing almost $1 trillion quote unquote defense, which is a quote aggression bill, right? Let's call it what it is. And so if the US was actually doing a fraction of what Biden even said he would do, there would be no money to focus elsewhere. So there's this saying that you can tell the sort of the state of a race or the state of a nation by the level of its women. Likewise, you can tell the state of a nation state or a place like the US by the state of its subjected peoples. So if the US doesn't care about the racialized people here, the women, the minoritized, the colonized people here, why on earth would they care about those people elsewhere? The US is never doing anything to save any people. It is doing it for money, for resources, for spheres of influence, and for geopolitical domination and unipolarity, full stop. So that is what the US can do for Ukrainians. And the Russia question, it is a deflection. People can have whatever position they want on that, but our responsibility in the belly of the beast is to hold the US accountable, the UN, NATO accountable, and the EU, the EU, NATO, US axis of domination. That is what our historical task and our responsibility is, period.
I feel like it was great. Good. Let's move on to the next question. Reyes, do you want to pick the next one?
Yeah, so, there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of information out there about like the sovereignty of the people and Ukrainians, right? And this kind of brought up some thoughts in our our participants here. And I think it's really important because the question is, could any of the panelists speak to the differences between European nationalism versus African indigenous nationalism, particularly how it pertains to Ukrainian nationalism? And I'm glad whoever asked this, thank you, because I think a lot of people, when they hear nationalism, they immediately associate it with white supremacy. And let's shift that, right? Let's make sure that we're really uplifting, the self-determination of the working class peoples in nationalism instead of what we always gravitate towards to white supremacy. So if anybody feels like they want to maybe answer that, please go ahead.
Sure, I'll chime in. I think it's really important for people to realize that a lot of the movements that we praise and look to for guidance historically were nationalist movements from colonized people. And it's important for us to distinguish the difference between revolutionary nationalism in service to the liberation of colonized people versus the kind of very predatory, patriotic nationalism that we see the US exert or other Western powers exert. And that's because for us, as Black, Brown, and Indigenous people, we need something to rally around, to lift the spirits of our people, to instill hope, and to create popular movements, right? And so I think it's really important to understand that revolutionary nationalism with service to liberation is absolutely necessary for any liberation project, and that should never be confused with the predatory imperialist nationalism of of countries like the US. Now in the Ukraine, I think it's a very specific formation there. What we're seeing now is a nationalism kind of being built around the praising of their straight up Nazi past, right? We're seeing Zelensky, a Jewish man, praising Stepan Bandera, who was a straight up Nazi, and it's because the nationalism that's being built there, encouraged by the U.S. intervention in the coup, is being built around that history, and we see that happen in other places too. But yeah, I think it's important for us to defend the revolutionary nationalism of colonized people, because I often see a lot of people on the left just denounce it as something that is going to ultimately end up being like authoritarian, and I just I don't buy it.
Well, and also the label of nationalism, we have to clarify terms, because often the US or the US media will use the term nationalism to not use the term national socialism, which is fascism. And so it will call things pro-democracy or nationalist to obfuscate what they actually are. I think the other important thing about revolutionary nationalism is that it's always internationalist. It's always solidaristic. So revolutionary nationalists were pan-africanists. They were third worldists. They were non-aligned. So there's that internationalism that is, the nationalism is a basis for internationalism, right? It's the sort of base of struggle. And it's often toward a broader goal, ultimately to transcend the nation state. If we even look at the idea of a United States of Africa, for example, and so always nationalism in the service of liberation is not the same as nationalism in the service of domination and the contravention of sovereignty. One is about self-determination and one is about undermining self-determination. And people like goofy ass Paul Gilroy, who try to elide these, simply do not understand history. So I'll just stop there.
Yeah, it's really important not to make the history of Europe the history of the world. That is what the analysis underlying why people tend to have an across-the-board anti-nationalist position, because European nationalism, with the exception of revolutionary Irish nationalism, is extremely reactionary. But just because nationalism had reactionary expression in Europe does not mean that that is universally the case for all nationalist struggles. We have seen throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout the Americas, revolutionary nationalist movements that had internationalist politics, socialist politics, just like Dr. CBS just laid out. So again, do not make the history of Europe the history of the world. One more question that's good, very spicy, is can any of the panelists name any current or recent examples of US and right-wing fascist alliances that resulted in attempts of or actual regime change?
Brazil,
Bolivia,
Nicaragua, Honduras,
Venezuela.
Yeah.
Ethiopia,
Oh,
Libya.
man.
I mean, is this a real question? Erica asked that. I didn't know if that was a real question.
The list.
Yeah. Does anyone want to go deeper into any of those examples?
I mean, like, even just thinking about like just Bolivia, for example, which is like the situation that I'm a little bit more familiar with, so I'll use it. It's like, you have you have US backed actors, right? Like Hadid Anyez, who took power there. And they tried to build popular support, right? They use neo-Nazi militias who are already, just like terribly violent in the streets, and they give them backing and they give them power. But even there, they didn't gain popular support because people were just like, screw that. And so the coup failed. Like, it failed spectacularly. And like, even now, like in Venezuela too, they tried to install like Juan Guaido, and now the US is calling back to Nicolas Maduro, trying to make an oil deal because they know that he is the rightful and legitimate like president. Like, and so I just think like you see the same thing happening over and over again. They have it down to a formula, like the way coups work. Like, you can see the similarities, you see the same tactics being used over and over again, where the far right is amplified and given support and is portrayed to people in the US as being the resistance and the freedom fighters who need our support. And like, in all those examples, Venezuela, Bolivia, and now Ukraine, we see the US left falling so hard for it, and it's scary. That's all I'll say.
Something that Gerald Horn mentioned earlier that I think is important is that we need to disaggregate. So the left, so there's the Euro-American left, and then there's like the left. Because one thing that he noted, so the racialized left is actually like a bit more discerning, just because number one, we take anti-racism as a given, like we don't have to get there. We already know like racism is bad. And so there is a way that I think the Euro-American left, especially in the context of the United States, is particularly reactionary. This is not to say that the African-Americans, and I'm using that very deliberately, the African-American left is not also backward in some ways, but I also think that it is like the Euro-American left that tends to drive the left as a whole to the right because of things like, what was it? Socialist patriotism and just confusion that is meant to obfuscate like their racism. So they don't want to admit settler colonialism. They don't want to admit, they want to reduce all everything to identity politics or wokeism. And so I think that it's a real failure to grapple with the realities of like racialization and colonialism. And until the Euro-American left can contend with that and be honest about that, I think that we're not going to get very far. And that's why they fall for all of these okie dokes over and over and over again.
I just want to add really quickly regarding recent examples of the US and also NATO allying with fascist forces. The example of Bolivia that Jen discussed, where a far right movement that didn't have a mass base was still able to like threaten state power, like initiate a coup that was later overturned by the masses. Like, that example is a really good way to understand what happened in Ukraine in 2014. In 2014, the US backed far right and neo-Nazi forces in an uprising that was known as the Euromaidan. The far right and the neo-Nazis were not the majority of the people on the ground during that uprising. It was actually Ukrainian people who are not Nazis. Most of them are not Nazis, who were dissatisfied with the current government, were dissatisfied, like with dissatisfied with economic problems and who were taken to the streets to express genuine discontent. What happened is that those neo-Nazi and fascist forces were extremely organized and also willing to use violence. And so they quickly dominated the protests. And when the protests led to the toppling of Yanukovych's government, the far right and the neo-Nazis, again with Western backing, were poised to take power. They never had a mass base in Ukraine, but they had organization, Western backing, and the willingness to use violence. That's how that happened. And so when people talk about the relatively small size of the far right in Ukraine, you have to understand it's a red herring. As CBS laid out, they're integrated into the police, they're integrated into the military, they have high-ranking positions within the government, and they have vigilante, highly organized, violent organizations that allow them to dominate political life in Ukraine. It doesn't matter that Zelensky's Jewish. It doesn't matter that they're a relatively small segment of the population. It's their level of organization and willingness to use violence that makes it decisive. And that's precisely what happened in Bolivia. So I'll pass it to Reyes.
Thank you, Oni. We're actually going to do one more question, and hopefully, this can be like a good wrap up, because this question is actually asking, okay, well, how do we practically plan for neo-Nazis, for white supremacists, for Proud Boys, and those that come back home, or that are in our own territories to commit violence and racism against like our people here? Like, so the question is like, should we arm ourselves and start talking about gathering in groups for self-defense? Maybe this is something that we reference like what the Black Panthers did. Or, is this too far ahead in their thinking, too adventurous, is what this person is asking. And I think that this question is very valuable, because it like, when you think about it, it's important to think about, do we want to do this? Is it important? How can we do it in a way that is also safe, and also making sure that we are going to do it in a way where we're keeping security culture in mind as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and pass it off.
Cool. So we want to thank y'all so much for joining us for this webinar. We appreciate your questions, your engagement, your feedback that was like coming throughout. It was very, very energizing. We deeply appreciate your time. There are many things you could be doing on a Friday night, and you chose anti-imperialist political education. Shout out to y'all. Shout out to y'all. So once again, this event was organized by the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition. Actually, let me put some logos and some websites on the screen so you can see who we are. Can I? There we go.
Can I add one last thing real quick,
Yes, go ahead.
Tony? So yeah, thank you for, just, coming out into this virtual space with us. I just want to offer, because I'm always talking about it, make sure that you guys are balancing your time and your reading and taking care of your bodies, because we know damn well that capitalism really wants us to run, our bodies dry and to the core where we feel like defeated. So let's not let capitalism win against our bodies. Take care of yourselves and make sure that, you're doing whatever you need to do to, make sure that you're remaining balanced in all aspects.
Thank you so much for that contribution, Reyes. Very, very important to take care of ourselves, because this work is hard. And also living under capitalism, imperialism is hard. It's actually terrible. And that's why we have to tear it down. So this event was organized by the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition in partnership with Black Alliance for Peace and the Red Nation. The Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition is Pueblo Action Alliance, which you can learn more about at puebloactionalliance.com. The Red Ant Collective, follow them on Facebook. And the All African People's Revolutionary Party, which you can learn more about at aprp-intl.org. Also, showing up for racial justice, Albuquerque chapter, follow them on Instagram at ABQ Surge. The Black Alliance for Peace, highly recommend if you want to up to the minute analysis of imperialism's efforts around the world and the resistance to them. Black Alliance for Peace is a key organization to follow, so check them out, blackallianceforpeace.com. And also our comrades at the Red Nation, who really have put forward the blueprint for returning to indigenous sovereignty in the United States within a revolutionary socialist framework. So you can learn more about the Red Nation at therednation.org. And also, we encourage you to follow the Albuquerque Anti-War Coalition if you want to hear about when we're doing more things like this. We have teach-ins quite often on all kinds of subjects. So if you want to get the word, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram at anti.war.abq. And if you have any questions, comments, or feedback, or if you're in Tiwa territory and you want to join the Anti-War Coalition, you can email us at anti-war-abq@protonmail.com. So we want to thank you again for joining us. We're going to send out an email after this tomorrow with the recording of the webinar, the resources that were shared in the chat, and the slides so you can share them widely. Also information about how you can participate in the digital mobilization happening next Friday, the 25th. But for now, we want to wish you a good night. Thank you so much for being here with us, and stay ready for revolution.
No compromise, no retreat.